Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I sit here once again in my 35 square meters of glorious gym empire, talking to you, answering your questions, and drinking schnapps. If it's good enough for Arnold Schwarzenegger, it's good enough for me. L'chaim. First up, apologies. I had some technical difficulties earlier related to me being an electronics retard. And so live won't happen. I'll just record this and then upload it later. McCover asks, what is the point of deficit deadlifts in place of regular deadlifts, and would you ever recommend it in a program? The short answer is that it helps the pull from the floor. So we have our basic big lifts like deadlifts and squat and bench and so on. And we sometimes find that a certain portion of the lift is weak and needs some assistance. Some people find that the hard part of the deadlift is breaking it off the floor. Once they get it off the floor, it simply flies up after that. So making it harder to come off the floor is one way to address that. Increase the range of motion, put it at a deficit. Things are more challenging to get off the floor, and the person will be a bit stronger off the floor, we hope. And they have one or two other uses in other lifts. They can be useful in cleans and snatches and so on, depending on the person and the weak points in their lifts. So yes, we have programmed them, and they were about as popular as pause squats and rack presses and all that stuff. The hardest stuff is usually the most effective and also the least popular. Matt and Marion ask about belt versus no belt lifting. Well, in thinking about belt versus no belted lifting, think what is actually happening in the trunk. So if you think about the structure of the during the lift, if you think about the structure of a spine, the neck part of the spine is not very well supported, but it's just holding up the head. So it's all right. Then the thoracic spine, the part that's attached to the rib cage, that's very well supported because it's got the whole rib cage all about it. Jumping over a bit down to the sacrum, that's the part that's attached to your pelvis. That is fused in anyone over 25, and as well, even without that, it's attached to the pelvis. So that's pretty bomb-proof, the sacrum down there. But the lumbar spine, the part between the pelvis and the rib cage, is not attached to any bony anatomy, and it has the weight of most of your trunk to deal with. So that's the one that needs some other form of support, and it gets muscular support. Now, if you think about the structure of the abdominal muscles, for example, there's a vertical layer, and there's a horizontal layer, and then there's a diagonal layer. Now, if the function of the abdominal muscles were to simply help you do crunches, then they wouldn't be shaped like that. They'd be shaped like a long, chunky muscle, like the hamstrings or something. So, why are they structured that way? Well, you can think of, for example, a circus tent. A circus tent by itself is not very structurally sound. It'll fall over quite easily. But it has all those crisscrossing cables. When one cable is slack, other cables tighten up and pull it back. So the trunk muscles, especially abdominal muscles, are very much like that. Now the issue is that most people spend most of their day like this, sitting in a chair. So the back muscles get some work, but as you can feel, when you're sitting down, the abdominal muscles are getting no work at all. So those ones are typically weak. For this reason, during a lift, a person must consciously activate those muscles, must switch them on. Now, it's a bit counterintuitive. Our instinct is to pull our guts in, pull it in tight. The issue is this. That's not what you do instinctively when you are pushing something heavy. For some reason, people do it in the gym, but they act differently when they're encountering heavy things outside. Something heavy outside, you've got to lift a log or something, take a deep breath in. Or your car stops at a light, take a deep breath in, hold it, push, let some breath out, and keep pushing. You certainly don't do what used to be advised a lot in gyms, which was to, you don't push your car like that. That wouldn't work. Now the reason that you take your breath in is it increases the pressure inside the thoracic and the abdominal cavity, and that increased pressure inside supports the spine. As well, that increased pressure inside makes all the muscles outside contract to stop your guts exploding out everywhere. Now, we can make those muscles activate more strongly by means of a lifting belt. If when you're wearing a belt, you take a deep breath in and you push your belly out against the belt, trying to burst the belt, that makes the contraction stronger, the muscular contraction stronger. And that then supports the spine a lot better. Where is it? Fourlegged stool. Another way to think of the spine is like a four-legged stool, or the trunk. It's like a four-legged stool. This back here is the muscles of the lower back. This back here is the muscles of the abs. If you're not using the muscles of the abs, it's like leaning back on a chair, which your mother always told you not to do. And the reason she told you not to do that is that very easily happens. And if one of the legs is dodgy, it just falls over completely. If you can bring it onto all four legs, even if one of the legs is a bit dodgy, wobbles a little bit, but it'll still stay up. So switching on all those muscles of the trunk is making your spine bomb-proof. Wearing a belt assists in that. Now, as for when we use it, we will tend to use it with newbies, but not so... we will not use it for newbies, but later on they may use one. The newbie does not really need a belt. They need to learn to switch all their muscles on. They can't make much use of the belt if they don't know how to switch their trunk muscles on. If they don't know how to take a deep breath in. And they don't really need one because they're squatting the empty bar or 40 or 60 kilograms or something, and they have to work pretty hard to hurt themselves with that little weight. Later on, as the weight gets heavier, they are more experienced with consciously activating their muscles. So they both need and can benefit from wearing a belt. The other group of people who can benefit from wearing a belt, perhaps a bit earlier on, are those with a history of lower back issues. When we see them lifting, we typically find that their spine is moving around in a very snaky kind of fashion. Having this big stiff belt there tends to stop that and helps them keep things more solid. And that's important because by their lower back injury, this person has demonstrated a history of having a fragile back. So we'll generally try to give it a bit of support a bit earlier on than we would for the person with the completely healthy back. Matt also asks about protein supplements. He just said protein supplements. I assume he wasn't asking for a recommendation, but just whether or not protein supplements in general were useful, or my thoughts on them. For people with a healthy diet, protein supplements are not necessary. The Australian Dietary Guidelines suggest 3 serves of meat a day, each serve of meat being about 100 grams or so, but palm-sized piece. And each serve of meat will have 20 to 30 grams of protein, depending on what kind of meat or fish you choose. They also suggest having 2.5 serves of dairy a day. A serve of dairy being something like 200 mils of yogurt, cup of milk, 40 grams of cheese and so on. those 2.5 serves of dairy, again, depending on what you choose, will give you another 20 or 30 grams of protein. So already just considering the meat and the dairy, you've got about 100 grams of protein. 60 if you choose all vegetarian options, but if you're not vegetarian, then you're looking at 100 grams of protein. Then you throw in all the other stuff, the 3 cups of chopped veggies, and the fruit and everything will have small amounts, and the grain will have some amounts, and so on. And you're looking at the person having 100 to 140 grams of protein a day, simply from following the Australian dietary guidelines that everyone likes to rubbish, even though nobody follows them. Now, as well, in those guidelines, they have 0 to 3 for men, 19 to 50, or 0 to 2.5 for women, 19 to 50, discretionary serves. And traditionally, the discretionary serves are used for this, or chocolate, or chips, or that sort of thing. But they do note that the discretionary serves can also be used for additional serves from the other food groups. Nobody's really worried if you have extra fruit or extra veggies. If you are running a lot, then extra starchy stuff, extra grains can be useful. And if you are lifting a lot, then perhaps some extra meat or dairy will be useful, particularly if you're hoping to gain weight. So with 0 to 3 extra serves, and each serve being about 25 grams of protein, you're quickly getting up to as much protein as anyone needs. The Australian Institute of Fitness, who we would hope know something about building muscle, recommend 1.4 to 1.8 grams of protein daily per kilogram of body weight for those trying to gain muscular weight. So with at least 100, well, 100 will be enough for about a 60 kilogram person, and 140 will be enough for a 100 kilogram person. And as I said, if it proves not enough, well, there's those extra discretionary serves. More meat, more dairy for that person. So with all that in mind, that should be more than sufficient. And that's talking about the Australian Institute of Sport, where people are pushed pretty hard. Most of us are not pushing ourselves that hard, so we won't have as great a demand for protein. Where the protein powder can be useful is in the case where a person is physically not used to eating as that much. An underweight teenager, for example. Because it's easier to have liquid calories, as every obese person knows, because they tend to have lots of soft drinks or alcohol. So it's easier to have liquid calories, so the protein powder can be useful in that regard. When I was in the army, on recruit course, I was a 65 kilogram statuesque monster, and after 13 weeks of recruit course, I was 83 kilograms, because they made me eat. You'd get served a certain amount of food, and the corporal would stand there until you finished it. And I distinctly remember sitting there almost in tears. I can't eat anymore, corporal. And he's saying, well, that's fine. The others will be outside in the rain doing push-ups until you're finished. So I finished. Now, those of us who do not have an abusive father figure to control our eating, either way, can benefit from protein powder in that respect, that it is an easy way to get the protein. The second group of people who can benefit from a protein powder are people who wish to get the protein but don't want to get everything else that comes with it in regular food, the carbohydrates, the fats. So they're trying to gain muscle while gaining the minimum amount of fat. That's mostly just competitive bodybuilders. Those of us who are just squatting, pressing and pulling 3 times a week probably don't really need to worry about that too much, because we don't really care if we're 20% body fat versus 15% body fat or something, whereas the bodybuilder deeply cares about these things. So, in sum, protein powder, not necessary if you have an otherwise healthy diet, can be helpful to those who are underweight and physically not used to eating enough. And to people who are particularly sensitive about body fat gain. That said, they're not harmful unless you're lactose intolerant or something. Troy asks your thoughts on RPE style programming. For those who don't know, he's referring to the rate of perceived exertion. The idea being that you have ups and downs, you have good days and bad days, and that you adjust your training accordingly. The problem is, Troy, most people are either wusses or meatheads. The wusses will claim that everything is super hard, even though any objective observer can see the bars. And the meatheads can do this horrible grindy squat and make a complete dog's breakfast of it, and they'll claim, oh yeah, that was easy. So most people are not very good at rating their own exertion. They can, with practice, get better at it, but it takes a fair amount of practice. Now here in the gym, that's not necessary. I will rate it for you because I'm watching most of the reps, if not all of them, certainly all of them in a newbie. So I will rate it for you, and if it's too much, I'll tell you to take some weight from the bar. And if it's too little, well, I'll make a mental note of it and make your next program harder. The person training on their own doesn't have that objective eye. As I said, they can in time develop it, but it takes quite a bit of time and mental energy, and I would rather people be putting their mental energy towards things like eating better food. 80-20 rule, as in all things, 20% of the things you can do will give you 80% of the results. If a person's not getting enough protein in, not getting enough veggies, not getting enough sleep, they don't really need to worry about whether that set of squats was a 7.5 or an 8 out of 10 on the exertion scale. Most people have got bigger things to worry about in their training. So it's not bad, it's just difficult and in most cases unnecessary. If you want an easy or a simple version of RPE, you just look at doing some as many sets. If you lifted a certain weight for 5 reps, then 5 reps, then as many as you could, and one time it was 12 reps and another time it was 8 reps, well, that tells you about, that one day was up and the other day was down. That tells you something. And also with an as many set, you're getting some extra reps in, which is almost always good. So yeah, RPE, tricky to learn and not super useful for most people. If they're being coached, there's somebody there watching, can judge things for them and adjust things for them. And that overcomes somebody's innate wussiness or innate meatheadedness. And either will mess them up. Lahira asks, can you talk about different reps for men versus women? This is, well, okay, we can get pretty technical on this. So the theory is backed by some studies and quite a bit of experience. Women can get more reps closer to their 1 rep maximum than can men. Now the theory behind this is that even when women are doing a 1 rep maximum, they're not actually contracting 100% of their muscle fibers the way a man would, or at least an experienced man. It's more like 85%. So if 80% of your max is, for example, 5 reps, but for a woman, it's still 80% of her max is 5 reps, but then 85% is 1 rep, you quickly see that they can perform quite a lot of reps at just below their maximum. And if recruiting 60 to 80% of your muscle fibers is necessary for muscular growth, assuming you don't just go to failure all the time, if doing 60 to 80% of your max is necessary, then women just need more reps. to get there next to the max. More reps next to the max to be able to progress. So, and this seems to be especially true of upper body lifts. And when we come to train them, we find that women can both tolerate and seem to benefit from a higher volume of training. So for example, they do 5 sets of 5 presses instead of 3 sets of 5. It also means that they can benefit from a high volume of training near their max with lower reps. So for example, the 5 sets of 5 presses becomes 8 sets of 3. And a man could not do 8 sets of 3 at 90% of his max. He just wouldn't get the reps out, and therefore he would not benefit from them. Yeah, I think that's about it for the sets and reps and the weights selected and differences between men and women. That is the theory. It is still being explored by coaches and trainers who have a lot of women. Unfortunately, there don't seem to be a lot of them, and most of them don't keep any data. The lifting world's a bit of a sausage fest, and those sausages are not writing things down and noting things. We do, and that's why we have the impression and the understanding, I would hope, that women seem to need and can benefit from a higher volume than men and a higher volume at closer to their max than a man would. Troy asks, why snatch grip deadlift in Alps? Alps, most of you won't know, Alps is the little novice program that we've been using here at ACE for a while as an evolution of starting strength. It means the aesthetic linear progression to swole, which is a daft name, but we had to call it something. The variations are the athletic linear progression to swole and the able linear progression to swole. The aesthetic being the general one, the athletic one being the one with cleans and snatches for the more athletically minded and able, and the able one, I was going to call it the aged one, but that's could be a bit depressing. So we call it the able one for people who have some degree of impairment, such as being 60 or having a messed up lower back, that sort of thing. So they do things like rack pulls, and back squat rather than front squat, and that sort of thing. Anyway, we have snatch grip deadlift in this. We also have press and front squat. So the method is that we press, front squat and snatch grip deadlift for the first 2 weeks, so 6 times in a row to groove those movement patterns in. And then after that, we alternate where one session is, again, press, snatch grip deadlift and front squat. And the other session is front squat, chin-ups or barbell rows, depending on the person, and farmer's walks or suitcase carries. Now, the basic three, those basic 3 barbell lifts, why we've chosen them, is that they are safer for newbies, they are less load, and they give comparable results to their more difficult variations, our brothers. If you can press it, you can bench press it. The reverse is not true. If you can front squat it, you can back squat it. The reverse is not true. If you can snatch grip deadlift it, you can conventional deadlift it, and the reverse is certainly not true. Now, these 3 lifts are more idiot-proof than the others because they are harder to fuck up, and if you do fuck them up, you don't hurt yourself. In a low bar back squat, the most common error we see is the knees sliding back, and so the bar coming forward, and the person coming up and doing this horrible good morning squat, which is asking rather a lot of the lower back there. People also lean forward on the front squat, but when you lean forward on the front squat, the weight doesn't come up, you just lean forward and drop more and drop it. So it's more idiot-proof and safer. The press, well, the bench press is the only barbell lift that has ever killed anyone. A person, or invariably a male, he loads it up with more weight than he can handle, and he drops it on himself, and he either ruptures the vena cava or something inside himself and bleeds out, or he drops it on him and slowly suffocates to death over 20 or 30 minutes, and is found the next morning by a rather alarmed gym manager. But if you miss a press, it just sits there on your shoulders until you decide to either drop it or put it back in the rack. The conventional deadlift can be set up round backed and still come up. Really horribly, but comes up. We had a guy in the gym who came to us because he had a busted back, because training on his own, he had herniated a couple of discs deadlifting 60 kilograms. He must have made a complete dog's breakfast of it. It must have been awful. But the weight came back anyway. Came up anyway. You just look at Dave Franco and you can see some horrible deadlifts that came up. He's resilient enough that he can handle it, but not all of us are. So it can be set up rounded, and of course the person can do that thing where they straighten their knees and their back rounds and then it comes up. You can't do that with a snatch grip deadlift, not with any substantial weight. It just forces you to set your back properly. What you can do is kind of squat it down and the bar comes forward, but usually nothing horrible happens compared to messing up a conventional deadlift. The press, the front squat and the snatch grip deadlift are less load than the bench press, the low bar back squat and the conventional deadlift. Because they are less load, it doesn't take as much out of you. What we found with starting strength was that in the second month with an aggressive progression, or in the third month with a more conservative progression, everybody was tired all the time. They were sore all the time, and various little tendinopathies were popping up. And they were having to eat like a horse with intestinal worms. It was all a bit sad, really. But with press, front squat and snatch grip deadlift, you're using basically 70% of the load of low bar back squat, bench press and conventional deadlift. So it doesn't take as much out of you, and you don't have to eat like a horse, and you're not sore all the time, and you're not getting injuries. And then when we transfer them over to doing those other lifts, they're as strong as they would have been had they trained them for those 3 months. So for example, we had a young guy here who worked up to snatch grip deadlifting 70 or 78 or something, and then when he came to do a conventional deadlift, he could do a grindy single with 120. Now to get 120 deadlift from a conventional deadlift, he would have had to do work sets with 100. It just takes less out of you doing 75 kilogram snatch grip deadlift than doing 100 kilogram conventional deadlift. Likewise with the press and the front squat. So you get the same results with less load, less tiring, less hard work. I don't know about you, but it sounds good to me. Theo asks, can I play music while training? Does it help? Which is the best music for it? Yes, you can play music if you like. I tend not to bother, but that's just me. Lots of other people love it. Does it help? Well, lifting's a fundamentally boring activity. It just goes up and down and then you put it back in the rack. So some music can liven it up. It does tend to slow down workouts, I find, because people sit there listening to music rather than, getting up and lifting. Because if you get too bored between sets, you just go and do another set. Whereas if there's music playing or you have someone to talk to or whatever, then it takes... And this is how 1 hour workouts, well, I've designed workouts to be 1 hour, and this is how people take 1.5 or 2 hours, because they're sitting there and listening to music. Oh, I love this song, man. As for which music to play, 1980s, of course. The 1980s were the peak of Western civilization, and it's all been downhill since there. The 1980s were positive and happy and optimistic, and now everything is emo. Just look at Adam West's Batman and compare him to Christian Bale's Batman. It was a great movie, but it wasn't like Adam West's Batman. It was miserable. 1980s music. Manning asked, Steve Willis, aka Commando, has built a personal training persona around his prior ADF service. To what extent have you considered doing this, and how do you think your infantry days have influenced your training style? Well, funny thing is, Manny, it was actually a strong suggestion from more than one gym manager or colleague early on as a trainer that I do so. But the thing is, I left the army for a reason. And I was just infantry. I wasn't anything exciting like a commando, and I didn't do anything of note. So there's not really much persona to make out of that. And the other thing is that, however unsuccessfully, I do endeavour not to be a complete wanker. And that would kind of get in the way of it. Alright, next question. McCarver asks, diet and exercise after sickness, because she's lying around feverishly out west at the moment, having a miserable experience, and not just because she's in Warrnambool, but she's horribly ill. But she's still looking forward to going back to training. I think she's mostly just bored, lying around, sweating. Anyway, okay, exercise, that part is relatively simple. You do a mini novice progression when you come back. You start with the empty bar, because even that is going to leave you cripplingly sore. You start with the empty bar and you do a mini novice progression, but what the lifts that it took you 3 months to get to before, this time you might manage in 3 weeks also, depending on how long you were sick and how bad it was. Generally speaking, each week off sick is like 2 or 3 weeks off healthy, because not only were you sick, but because you were sick, you ate badly, just having lemonade and toast or something, and you slept badly as well. So each week off sick is like 2 to 3 weeks off from just laziness. So it takes more out of you than you might think when you get back to the gym. But as I said, in a few weeks you can get back to where you were after your first few months, and from there you can start doing regular programming again. As for what to eat, as I said, you will have eaten badly once sick. So simply returning to a healthy diet, following the Australian dietary guidelines of 3 serves of meat, 6 serves of grain, blah, 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 every day, that will be enough of a challenge for the first week or two. If you find that you have a lot of weight to regain, then once you've got that basic baseline of 3 meat, 3 cups of grains, blah, blah, blah. Once you've got that baseline down, you can add discretionary serves from the meat or the grain area in order to boost up your body weight and get back to where you were. The body weight will come back quicker than you expect, because a lot of it will be water weight from sweating out, and also glycogen and water weight from having used up all your body's energy reserves. Some of it will be lean mass, unfortunately, but it will come back quicker than you think. Oh, lastly, Nikki, my friend from Greece, living in the People's Republic of the European Union, asks, favourite score piece from the Godfather movies? Well, Nikki, nobody can go past the great old love theme, the classic Godfather theme, where he romanced the lovely Apollonia. Musically, that is a beautiful piece. But in terms of evoking moments from the movies, I can't go past the murder of Don Fanucci from Godfather Part 2. where there's some festival music playing while Robert De Niro horribly murders the local Don who's oppressing the locals. Because Don Fanucci was a guy who had it coming. So it was satisfying to see him die. He was pretentious and oppressive, so he had it coming. Didn't like his hat either. And if you have to be horribly murdered by Robert De Niro, you may as well have some cheery music playing while it's happening. So let's go out with that, shall we? L'chaim. Remember, there are many ways to do things. I have told you one way. It is, of course, the best way. You can choose it to do some other way if you wish, but then you will be wrong. And strong is not for you.